The chamber was already in session when Callum Marin arrived. He could hear the presiding arbiter's voice reverberating through the sealed antechamber doors, the vowels stretched in the Velori fashion, each syllable given its own gravity as though language were a form of architecture. Callum adjusted his collar, checked the seal on his diplomatic satchel, and placed his hand against the entry scanner. The doors parted. 512 delegates turned to look at him. He was 26 years old. He had been a credentialed diplomat for 9 weeks. The Terran Foreign Service had posted him to the Star League Assembly as a junior attaché, 4th tier, assigned to observe session proceedings and file summary reports for the senior delegation. His security clearance covered corridors, canteens, and the public gallery. He was not credentialed to speak on the assembly floor. He was the only human in the building. 31 hours earlier, the Terran delegation had been expelled. Not recalled, not suspended, not asked to leave. Expelled. The presiding arbiter, a Velori elder named Sethunkal, had invoked Procedural Article 19, the Emergency Exclusion Protocol, citing a formal petition from the Trade Compact of Kishura, alleging that the Terran Confederation had violated 8 standing trade agreements through what the petition called systematic commercial fraud. The petition had arrived on Sethunkal's desk at dawn. By mid-morning, the senior Terran delegation had been stripped of floor credentials and escorted to the transit docks by assembly security. By afternoon, the chamber had convened a formal session to vote on the Terran Confederation's permanent exclusion from the Star League. The vote was scheduled for this evening. It required a 2/3 majority. Preliminary counts suggested it would pass with room to spare. Callum had been in the canteen when the expulsion happened. He had watched the senior delegates file past the observation windows, their faces blank with the controlled neutrality that the Foreign Service drilled into every officer above 3rd tier. Ambassador Kessler had paused at the last window, looked back at the assembly spire, and said nothing. She had boarded the transit shuttle with her staff and departed within the hour. Callum had been left behind because nobody had remembered to revoke a 4th-tier observer credential, an administrative oversight, a clerical gap in a process designed to be airtight. He had spent the first 6 hours after the expulsion sitting in his quarters doing nothing. The room was small, the kind of prefabricated diplomats housing that the assembly provided for junior staff, a narrow bunk, a desk that folded out from the wall, a lavatory the size of a closet, and a window that looked out on the station's maintenance dock. He had sat at the desk and stared at the wall and thought about what to do. There was nothing to do. He was a 4th-tier observer. His function was to watch and report. The people who made decisions had been escorted to transit shuttles and sent home. He was the leftover, the one the system had not noticed. At some point in the 7th hour, he had pulled the assembly's procedural manual from the desk's built-in library terminal. He was not sure, later, what had prompted the action. Perhaps it was the habit of preparation that the Foreign Service Academy had drilled into him, the reflex of reaching for the manual when you did not know what else to reach for. Perhaps it was something less rational and more stubborn, the part of a person that refuses to accept a situation without first reading the rules that created it. He had opened the manual and begun to read. He read for 24 hours, all of it. 1,400 pages of bylaws, statutes, precedents, subsections, and interpretive notes, written in assembly standard script with annotations in 6 diplomatic languages, none of them Terran standard. He read it cover to cover, then read it again, marking every section that mentioned objections, hearings, floor rights, credential classes, and the specific procedural protections afforded to observers. He cross-referenced the observer statutes against the emergency exclusion protocols and found the gap. Statute 11, Section 4, any credentialed individual could file an objection to a procedural motion. Observer credentials were credentials. The exclusion was a procedural motion. The intersection was clear, narrow, and almost certainly unintentional. a legislative oversight from 9 centuries ago that nobody had closed, because nobody had imagined a situation in which a fourth-tier observer would be the only human left in the building. He had eaten 2 meals in 30 hours. He had slept for 90 minutes at his desk, waking with the imprint of a data tablet on his cheek and the page number still fixed in his mind. He had spent the remaining time memorizing evidence, the shipping manifests, the classification codes, the ownership registries, the monitoring data, the survey permits, the transit records, all of it stored in the data tablets that the senior delegation had left behind in the office they no longer occupied. Ambassador Kessler's office. The tablets had been on her desk, neatly stacked, labeled in her precise handwriting. They had been prepared for a hearing that had never happened because the delegation had been expelled before it could present its case. Callum had taken them. Nobody had told him to. Nobody had told him not to. Now he stood at the threshold of the assembly floor, and the presiding arbiter's compound eyes tracked him from the high bench like a targeting array acquiring a slow-moving object. "The chamber does not recognize this individual," Sethunkal said. His voice carried across the amphitheater without amplification, the acoustics of the hall designed to give the arbiter's seat absolute sonic dominance. "Terran credentials have been revoked. Remove him." 2 assembly marshals, broad-shouldered Drathani in polished ceremonial armor, moved toward Callum from their positions at the chamber's flanking aisles. Callum did not step back. He reached into his satchel and held up a single document, printed on the heavy stock the assembly used for formal filings. "My name is Callum Marin," he said. His voice was steady, not loud. He had practiced this in the mirror at 3 in the morning, speaking to his own reflection until the words came without tremor. "I hold a valid 4th-tier observer credential issued by this body. Observer credentials are governed by Procedural Statute 11, which is administratively separate from delegation floor credentials. My credential has not been revoked." The marshals stopped. They looked at the presiding arbiter. Sethunkal's mandibles clicked twice, the Velorai equivalent of a frown. "Observer credentials do not carry speaking rights," Sethunkal said. "No, presiding arbiter, they do not." Callum lowered the document. "But Procedural Statute 11, Section 4, grants any credentialed individual the right to file an objection to a procedural motion before a vote is called. The exclusion of the Terran Confederation is a procedural motion under Article 19. I am filing an objection." He placed the document on the nearest filing lectern, a slender column of polished alloy at the chamber's edge. The lectern's scanner activated, read the document, and projected a confirmation glyph in pale blue light above the surface. The glyph pulsed once and locked. The chamber went quiet, not the gradual fade of lost interest, but the sudden, structural silence of 500 beings simultaneously reassessing a situation. Sethunkal stared at Callum from the high bench. The presiding arbiter was old even by Velorai standards. His carapace faded to a dull amber, his compound eyes clouded at the margins. He had presided over the Star League Assembly for 31 years and had built a reputation for procedural precision that bordered on the pathological. Every ruling he issued was annotated, cross-referenced, and archived. He did not make procedural errors. He did not tolerate them in others. An objection to a procedural motion triggers a formal hearing under Assembly bylaw, Sethunkal said, each word measured. The objector is granted the floor until the objection is resolved or withdrawn. Is the objector aware of this? "I am," Callum said. "Is the objector aware that the floor, once granted, may not be yielded voluntarily until the arbiter rules on the objection, and that the arbiter's ruling requires a review of all evidence cited by the objector?" "I am." Sethunkal's mandibles clicked 3 times. The sound was sharp in the silent chamber. "Then the objector has the floor." Callum Marin, 26 years old, 9 weeks credentialed, walked to the speaker's platform at the center of the Star League Assembly and began to speak. The platform was a circular disc of polished granite, raised half a meter above the chamber floor, positioned at the precise acoustic center of the amphitheater. From this position, every word carried to every seat without amplification. The tiered seating rose around him in concentric rings, 512 seats arranged in the configuration the Star League had used for 9 centuries. Directly above, the glass dome of the chamber opened onto a daylight sky. Through the dome, the pale shapes of 3 Terran courier vessels held station at high altitude, their hulls catching the light like silver needles. They were not warships. They were diplomatic couriers, lightly armed, fast, and cheap. They had arrived with the delegation and had not departed with it. Nobody in the assembly had asked why. The petition from the Trade Compact of Kishora alleges 8 violations of standing trade agreements, Callum began. He spoke from memory. He had read the petition 7 times. I will address each violation in sequence and demonstrate that the evidence cited in the petition is either incomplete, misattributed, or fabricated. Sethan Call's compound eyes narrowed. The Trade Compact's delegation, seated in the 4th tier on the chamber's eastern arc, shifted collectively. Their lead representative, a Kishari named Velandor, leaned forward with her elongated fingers pressed flat against the armrest of her seat. She was young for a trade delegate, maybe 40 in Kishari years, her blue-black skin smooth and her cranial ridges sharp. She had authored the petition. She had spent 3 years building the case. Callum opened his satchel and withdrew a data tablet. Violation 1. The petition alleges that the Terran Confederation exported restricted mineral compounds to the Chelani Protectorate in breach of the Kishori Mineral Accord. Section 7. The evidence cited is a shipping manifest dated 14 months ago, showing a Terran cargo vessel departing the Velori transit hub with a hold registered as containing Category 3 minerals. He placed the tablet on the platform's display cradle. The chamber's holographic array projected the shipping manifest above him in pale cyan, the text in assembly standard script. 500 delegates read the manifest. The manifest is authentic, Callum said. The cargo was not. Category 3 minerals were listed on the manifest because the Terran Cargo Authority uses the same classification code for Category 3 minerals and Category 3 medical isotopes. The distinction is made in a subcode field that the Kishori Mineral Accord does not require signatories to display on external manifests. He advanced the display. A second document appeared beside the manifest, the Terran Cargo Authority's classification guide, with the subcode field highlighted. The cargo was medical isotopes bound for a Chelani hospital. The hospital's intake records confirm receipt. The Kishori petition did not include the subcode or the hospital records. Velandor rose from her seat. Point of order. The objector is presenting evidence that was not included in the original petition review. Procedural bylaw requires all evidence to be submitted through the Arbiter's office for authentication before floor presentation. Sethan Call's mandibles worked slowly. The objector filed a formal objection under Statute 11, Section 4. Under that statute, the objector may present evidence directly to the chamber during the hearing. The authentication requirement applies to petitioners, not objectors. He paused. The objector may continue. Velandor sat down. Her cranial ridges had darkened, the Kishori physiological response to surprise. She had not expected anyone to know the distinction. Callum continued. He walked through the shipping records line by line, the classification codes, the hospital intake logs, the subcode discrepancy, and the 3 separate occasions on which the Terran delegation had attempted to submit the corrected classification to the Assembly's Trade Arbitration Panel, and been told the submission window had closed. He spoke without notes for the final 10 minutes of the violation, the data fixed in his memory with the stubborn precision of someone who had stayed awake for 2 days memorizing it, because he understood that if he paused to check a reference, they would find a way to take the floor from him. The chamber absorbed the presentation, in a silence that shifted gradually from hostile to uncertain. In the third tier, the Chelani delegation's senior representative, a small gray-skinned woman named Asara Vel, had begun taking notes. Her stylus moved quickly, recording not just Callum's citations but the petition's omissions, building a parallel record that cross-referenced what had been presented against what had been left out. When Callum finished with Violation 1, he moved to Violation 2 without pause. Violation 2 alleges that the Terran Confederation manipulated commodity pricing on the Velori exchange through coordinated purchases of Drethium futures. The Velori delegation stirred. Drethium was the Star League's primary energy commodity, and accusations of market manipulation struck at the economic foundation of the body. Sethan Call's antennae rose a centimeter, the only visible sign of heightened attention from the presiding arbiter. The coordinated purchases cited in the petition occurred over a 16-day period, Callum said. The petition presents them as a single block trade executed through shell companies. The purchases were, in fact, 31 individual transactions conducted by 11 separate Terran commercial entities, each operating under independent trade licenses, none of which share ownership, board members, or financial backing. The petition groups them as coordinated because they occurred within the same pricing window. He placed a second tablet on the display cradle. Ownership registries, board compositions, and financial disclosures cascaded through the holographic display. By the same logic, 17 Kishori purchases in the same window would constitute coordination. The petition does not mention those. The 17 Kishori transactions appeared on the display, highlighted in amber against the blue of the Terran transactions. The Kishori delegation shifted in their seats. Two aides exchanged a glance that carried the weight of a calculation gone wrong. Velandor stood again. Objection. The Kishori transactions are irrelevant to the specific violations alleged. The Kishori transactions are relevant to the definition of coordination used in the petition, Callum said. If the definition applies to Terran purchases, it applies equally to Kishori purchases. If it does not apply to Kishori purchases, then the definition is being applied selectively, and the violation does not meet the standard of equal application required under Article 4 of the Star League Fair Commerce Code. He cited the code, he cited the section, he cited the paragraph. Velandor sat down. Sethan Call said nothing. 40 minutes on Violation 2. Every line of the ownership registries, every transaction date, every board composition. The holographic display above Callum's head grew dense with data, columns of figures and dates and names that built a wall of evidence so granular it was nearly impossible to argue with, because arguing with it would require engaging with every individual fact, and there were too many facts for any single objection to address. An hour and a half in, Callum's voice had settled into a rhythm that the chamber's acoustics carried with a clarity that worked against the Kishori delegation, and for the listeners. He was not an orator. He did not modulate his voice for effect. He spoke in the same flat, measured cadence from the first word to the last, and the flatness itself became a kind of authority, the sound of someone who was not trying to persuade but simply reciting what was true. Violation 3, Callum said. The petition alleges that the Terran Confederation conducted unauthorized intelligence operations within the Drenai corridor, specifically the deployment of surveillance probes in restricted diplomatic space. The Drenai delegation, broad-shouldered beings with rough bronze skin and deep-set amber eyes, leaned forward. The Drenai corridor was a sensitive topic. 3 trade wars had been fought over it in the past century. The probes in question are navigational buoys, Callum said. Their specifications are registered with the Star League Maritime Safety Bureau. They transmit on a public frequency. They carry no encryption capability and no data collection hardware beyond standard navigation telemetry. He placed the documentation on the cradle. Technical schematics appeared in the holographic display, annotated in both Terran standard and assembly script. The petition classifies them as surveillance probes because they contain a passive receiver array. Every navigational buoy in the Star League contains a passive receiver array. It is a mandatory safety component under Maritime Code 17, Section 12. The Kishari petition refers to the array as intelligence-gathering equipment, without noting that it is a standard navigation feature present on all buoys deployed by all member states. He advanced the display to show the Maritime Code specification. Section 12 was highlighted. The words passive receiver array, mandatory for all navigational aids deployed in shared-use corridors, glowed in the holographic light above the chamber. The Drenai senior delegate, a broad man named Torin Call, turned to the Chelani delegate beside him and spoke in a voice just loud enough for the nearby tiers to hear. The words were in Drenai, but the tone was unmistakable, the tone of someone who had supported the petition and was now re-evaluating. His aide, a younger Drenai with the close-cropped ceremonial scalp cut of the military caste, pulled up the buoy specifications on a personal display and began cross-referencing them against the Maritime Code. His expression shifted from skepticism to something quieter and harder: verification. In the Kishori section, Velandor turned to the delegate seated next to her and spoke rapidly, her elongated fingers cutting the air in short, emphatic gestures. The delegate shook his head. Whatever she was proposing, the answer was no. Callum watched the exchange in his peripheral vision and understood what it meant. The Kishori delegation was running out of procedural tools. They had tried authentication challenges. They had tried relevance objections. Both had failed because Callum was operating under a statute they had not anticipated anyone using, and the statute was older and more permissive than the rules that governed normal floor debate. 2.5 hours. Callum's voice had begun to dry at the edges, a faint catch at the end of each sentence that he controlled by swallowing between clauses. The chamber's recycled air was doing its work, pulling moisture from every surface it touched. He pressed on. Violation 4, he said. The petition alleges that Terran merchant vessels made unauthorized use of the Kishori transit corridor, bypassing toll stations and failing to pay assessed transit fees. The Kishori transit corridor, Callum said, is classified as a shared-use corridor under the Star League's Corridor Access Treaty of year 804. Shared-use corridors do not permit unilateral toll stations. The Kishori Transit Authority installed toll stations in the corridor 7 years ago under an administrative order that was never submitted to the Assembly for ratification. Under the Corridor Access Treaty, any toll station in a shared-use corridor that has not been ratified by the Assembly is legally a private obstruction. Terran vessels were not bypassing toll stations. They were navigating around private obstructions that had no legal standing. The Kishori delegation's cohesion cracked visibly. 2 delegates in the 4th tier turned to Velandor with expressions that combined alarm and accusation in roughly equal measure. She did not look at them. Her eyes were fixed on Callum, with the intensity of someone watching a structure she had spent 3 years building come apart at the joints. The Terran Confederation filed a formal complaint about the unauthorized toll stations with the Assembly's Transport Arbitration Panel 4 years ago, Callum continued. The complaint was assigned case number TAP 7714. It was scheduled for hearing. The hearing was postponed 3 times at the request of the Kishari delegation. It has never been convened. The tolls remain. The complaint remains open. The petition treats the unpaid tolls as a violation of trade agreements. The tolls themselves violate the Corridor Access Treaty. Velandor stood for the 4th time. Her voice had hardened into something between anger and tactical recalculation. Point of procedure. The objector is exceeding the scope of a procedural objection. He is relitigating resolved trade matters. The Assembly's arbitration records are not subject to floor review. Sethon Call's mandibles worked in the slow, deliberate motion that Callum had learned to read as the arbiter weighing a ruling. The objector is challenging the evidentiary basis of a petition that cites these trade matters as grounds for exclusion. If the petition placed them in scope, the objection may address them. The objector is within bounds. Velondor sat down. She did not speak again for 2 hours. 3 hours. Callum's throat had begun to tighten, the dryness settling into the tissue with a persistence that water would have fixed, except that he had no water. He had considered, briefly, asking one of the marshals for a drink. The marshals were neutral officers, bound to provide basic services to any individual on the chamber floor. But asking for water meant acknowledging that he was struggling, and he understood with the instinct of someone who had spent 9 weeks watching alien delegates read weakness, the way predators read a limp, that any sign of faltering would trigger a fresh wave of procedural challenges designed to test whether he could continue. The Kishori delegation was watching for exactly that moment. He swallowed against the dryness and kept his hands on the cradle. The assembly provided refreshment to delegates at their seats. He was not a delegate. He was an observer standing on a platform, and the protocol for observers did not include hydration, because no observer had ever been expected to speak for 3 hours. He moved to violation 5. His legs had begun to ache in a way that was no longer background discomfort, but a steady, insistent signal from muscles held in one position too long on an unyielding surface. He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, and felt the joint in his left knee protest with a small pop that the chamber's acoustics, mercifully, did not carry. Violation 5, he said. The petition alleges that Terran survey teams operated outside their authorized zones in the Drenai corridor, conducting geological assessments in areas designated as Kishori exclusive economic territory. The Drenai corridor was the most disputed region in the Star League's jurisdiction. 3 trade wars had been fought over its mineral rights. 2 species had gone to economic sanctions over its shipping lanes. The corridor's status was a permanent agenda item, and any accusation involving it carried the weight of a century of unresolved grievance. Callum produced the survey team's operating permits, which showed authorization from the Star League Survey Commission to operate throughout the corridor under a blanket exploration mandate issued to all member states. The Kishori exclusive designation had been applied retroactively, 6 months after the survey was completed, through an administrative reclassification that had not been submitted to the Assembly for approval. The reclassification, Callum said, was published in the Kishori Internal Gazette, which is not a recognized source of Star League territorial law. The Survey Commission was not notified. The Terran survey team was not notified. The petition treats the survey as a violation of a boundary that did not exist at the time the survey was conducted. He advanced the display. A timeline appeared, showing the survey dates and the reclassification date in parallel. The gap between them was 6 months and 11 days. The Terran survey team returned its data to the Survey Commission, which published the results in its annual report. The report was distributed to all member states, including the Trade Compact of Kishora. The Kishori delegation acknowledged receipt. No objection was filed. The reclassification occurred 5 months after the Kishori delegation acknowledged receipt of the survey data. The implications settled over the chamber. The Kishori had read the survey results, recognized the value of what had been found, and then retroactively claimed the territory to exclude the team that had found it. Torin Call, the Drenai senior delegate, stood. He did not speak. He simply stood, his broad bronze frame visible across the chamber, and looked at the Kishori section with an expression that needed no translation in any species' body language. Then he moved from his original seat in the 3rd tier to the 2nd tier, closer to the platform. The relocation was deliberate, visible, and public. In assembly body language, moving closer to the speaker's platform was an endorsement. 4 hours. His bronze face held an expression that Callum had not seen from any alien delegate in his 9 weeks at the assembly. The expression of someone paying attention not because protocol required it, but because the information mattered. Velandor interrupted for the 3rd time. The objector is relitigating matters that were adjudicated through the Assembly's arbitration process. The arbitration process, Callum said, requires both parties to be present. The Terran Confederation was expelled before the arbitration on violations 4 and 5 was completed. The Terran Confederation's position on these violations has never been heard by this body. That is what is happening now. Sethan Kal's mandibles clicked once. The objector is correct. Continue. Callum continued. He had passed the 4-hour mark, and his body had begun to register the cost. His legs ached from standing in one position on the granite platform. The chamber's temperature regulation, calibrated for the metabolic median of 12 species, held at a chill that had worked through his formal jacket and into his joints. His eyes were dry and slightly unfocused at the margins, the peripheral vision narrowing in the way that exhaustion narrows everything. He controlled the tremor in his hands by gripping the edges of the display cradle. Violation 6. A disputed water rights allocation on the shared colony of Thesson Prime. The petition alleged that Terran agricultural settlements had diverted river systems in excess of their allocated share, causing downstream ecological damage to Thessani pastoral communities. The original allocation agreement, Callum said, and his voice had settled into a register that was both quieter and more precise than it had been in the first hour, the sound of a mechanism that had burned through its initial energy and was now running on something leaner and more durable, was signed by the Terran Colonial Authority and the Thessani Pastoral Commission 9 years ago. It specifies exact diversion volumes, measurement points, and monitoring protocols. The Thessani Colonial Authority operates the monitoring stations. Their data is the authoritative record. He placed the monitoring data on the display cradle. 9 years of water flow measurements appeared in the holographic display, rendered as a blue gradient that showed the Terran diversion volumes against the allocated ceiling. The blue line ran consistently below the ceiling. In some years, substantially below. The total Terran diversion across 9 years is 14% below the allocated maximum, Callum said. The Thessani Colonial Authority's own data confirms this. The petition did not use this data. The petition used a different measurement standard, one that includes rainfall capture in agricultural reservoirs as part of the diversion total. This standard is not defined in the allocation agreement. It has never been used in any previous water rights dispute in the Star League. It was invented for this petition. He paused. The effect of the invented standard is to inflate the Terran diversion figure by 31%. Under the original standard, the Terran settlements are in compliance. Under the invented standard, they are in violation. The petition does not disclose that it used a non-standard measurement. The Thessani delegation, compact gray-furred beings with expressive ears that rotated independently, had been sitting in the 5th tier in attentive silence since the session began. Their species was cautious by temperament, slow to commit and slower to retract. When the Environmental Bureau's report appeared in the holographic display, showing the Thessani Colonial Authority's own data contradicting the petition's claims, the Thessani lead delegate's ears rotated forward and stayed there, locked in the Thessani posture of acute attention. She turned to her aide and spoke rapidly in the clipped, consonant-heavy Thessani dialect that carried even at a whisper. The aide left the chamber at a controlled walk that was trying very hard not to be a run. Where the aide was going, Callum could guess. To the Thessani Colonial Authority's offices on the station to pull their own copies of the monitoring data and confirm what the holographic display was already showing. 5 hours, something had changed in the chamber's mood. Callum could feel it the way a swimmer feels a current shift, not through any single indicator, but through the aggregate behavior of 500 beings whose collective posture had migrated from skepticism to something else. Not sympathy, not admiration. Something closer to the recognition that precedes both. The realization that the man on the platform was not performing, was not bluffing, was not stalling, but was systematically dismantling a 3-year legal effort with the meticulous persistence of someone pulling threads from a garment until the garment ceased to exist. In the upper galleries, several Velori diplomats who had been watching from the comfort of their formal recliners had risen and moved to the edges of their tiers, leaning against the stone rails to get a better view of the holographic display. The display was dense with data now. 6 violations worth of shipping manifests, classification codes, ownership registries, buoy schematics, water flow measurements, territorial timelines, and transit records, layered over one another in the kind of evidential mosaic that would take a team of legal analysts weeks to compile and verify. Callum had compiled it from memory, pulling each document from his satchel and placing it on the cradle with the same unhurried deliberateness, the same flat narration, the same refusal to editorialize or summarize or rush. Callum was aware that delegates had been leaving and arriving in a slow circulation, some departing for meals or consultations, others arriving because word of what was happening had spread through the assembly's corridors and residential quarters. The chamber had thinned to perhaps 300 in the upper galleries, but the lower tiers were as full as they had been at the start. The composition had changed. The delegations most directly affected by the petition's claims, the Chelani, the Dreni, the Thessani, had consolidated into the front rows. Their representatives sat in clusters, checking Callum's citations against their own records on personal displays, the soft glow of their screens adding a scattered constellation of light to the cyan wash of the chamber's holographic systems. The Velori press corps remained at full strength in their gallery, their recording arrays fixed on Callum with the focused intensity of beings witnessing something they could not categorize. 2 freelance stringers had joined them in the past hour, species Callum did not recognize, their equipment compact and portable in the way that suggested independent outlets rather than state media. Asara Vel, the Chelani delegate, had moved from the 3rd tier to the 2nd. Her notes now covered 3 seats. Callum moved to violation 7. His voice had developed a hoarseness that the chamber's acoustics turned into something almost granular, each word pressed through the dryness like grain through stone. Violation 7. The Kishori petition alleges that Terran shipping interests refused to pay a retroactive lane access surcharge imposed by the Kishori Transit Authority. The surcharge was imposed 9 months after the shipping occurred, calculated against rates that did not exist at the time of transit, and applied specifically and exclusively to Terran-flagged vessels. He placed the document on the display cradle. The Kishori Transit Authority has no statutory power to impose retroactive surcharges. The authority's own charter, Section 31, limits surcharges to prospective application only. The charter was ratified by the Star League Assembly 12 years ago. He paused. Presiding Arbiter Sethan Kal cast the deciding vote. In the high bench, Sethan Kal's antennae lowered a fraction. The Arbiter said nothing, but his compound eyes, which had been tracking Callum with the impassive attention of a recording device, shifted for the first time. Not to Velon Dor, not to the Kishori delegation, to the charter reference glowing in the holographic display above Callum's head, where his own name appeared as the ratifying authority. For a being who had built a career on procedural precision, the implication was surgical. The petition relied on a power that the Arbiter himself had voted to prohibit. The 6th hour began. Callum's hands had developed a fine tremor. His eyes were dry and beginning to sting under the chamber's recirculated air. He had not eaten in over 20 hours. The granite platform beneath his feet had become a kind of anchor, The solidity of it the one constant in a room where everything else, the lighting, the temperature, the mood, the faces and the tears, kept shifting. Violation 8 was the largest. It concerned the allegation that the Terran Confederation had secretly constructed military infrastructure in the neutral corridor, a demilitarized zone that the Star League maintained as a buffer between three rival trade blocs. This was the charge that carried the most weight, because the neutral corridor was the single issue on which every delegation agreed. It must remain unarmed. Accusations of militarizing it were existential. The structure in question, Callum said, is a communications relay. Its specifications are public record. It was built under a joint infrastructure grant from the Star League's own Communications Bureau, which approved the design, funded 40% of the construction, and assigned 2 Velorai engineers to oversee the installation. He placed the final tablet on the cradle. The construction permit appeared in the display, co-signed by the Communications Bureau, the Velorai Engineering Corps, and the Terran Confederation's Infrastructure Division. The petition classifies it as military infrastructure because the relay's signal strength exceeds the threshold in the Neutral Corridor Arms Limitation Treaty. The threshold was set in the original treaty, which predates the current communications standard by 90 years. Every modern relay in the Star League exceeds that threshold. There are 14 such relays in the neutral corridor. All 14 exceed the threshold. The petition mentions only the Terran relay. The 14 relays appeared on the display, their signal strengths listed in a column. All 14 exceeded the treaty threshold. 13 belonged to Star League member states. 1 belonged to the Terran Confederation. 1 had been singled out for prosecution. Callum stood on the platform and said nothing for 10 seconds. 10 seconds of silence in a chamber, acoustically designed to carry every breath, was a very long time. The 300 remaining delegates sat in the silence and absorbed the shape of what they were seeing. Not 8 separate violations, but a single coordinated effort to build a case by selecting, from a universe of equally applicable facts, only the facts that pointed at one species. He was 7 hours in. The dome above the chamber had shifted from bright daylight to the amber of late afternoon. Through the glass, the 3 Terran courier vessels still held station, their hulls now catching the lower sun in tones of copper and gold. They had not moved. They had not communicated with the assembly. They simply remained, a quiet fact in the sky that nobody had addressed and nobody could ignore. "Those are the 8 violations cited in the petition," Callum said. His voice had gone from hoarse to something almost abraded, a quality that the chamber's acoustics could not smooth. "I have addressed each one. I have presented evidence for each one. The evidence is in the Assembly's record. The objection stands." Sethan Kal spoke from the high bench. "The objector has addressed the substance of the petition. Under Statute 11, the Arbiter may now rule on the objection." Callum did not move. "Presiding Arbiter, I have addressed the substance of the petition. I have not addressed the petition itself." The chamber stirred. Sethan Kal's mandibles clicked once. "Clarify." Procedural Article 19 requires that an emergency exclusion petition be filed by a member state with standing. Standing is defined in Article 19, Section 2, as a demonstrated material injury resulting from the actions cited in the petition. The Trade Compact of Kishora has not demonstrated material injury. The petition cites potential injury, projected injury, and theoretical injury. It does not cite a single completed transaction in which the Kishori economy suffered a measurable loss as a result of Terran action. Velon Dor stood. The petition framework does not require completed injury. Potential injury is sufficient under the doctrine of preventive commerce. The doctrine of preventive commerce, Callum said, was proposed at the Kishori Trade Summit 11 years ago. It was debated for 3 sessions. It was not adopted. It does not appear in the Star League's procedural code. The Trade Compact of Kishore has been citing it as established law in internal communications for the past decade. It is not law, it is a rejected proposal. The chamber was absolutely silent. Velandor remained standing. Her mouth was slightly open. Her cranial ridges had gone pale, the Kishore physiological response to a threat recognized too late. Callum turned back to the presiding arbiter. The petition lacks standing under the actual procedural code. The exclusion vote is based on a petition that does not meet the requirements of the article under which it was filed. I am not asking this body to rule on the merits of the petition. I am asking this body to rule on whether the petition should have been accepted at all. Sethunkal did not answer immediately. The arbiter sat at his bench and looked at Callum Marin with an expression that the chamber's archival cameras would later categorize as unreadable. His compound eyes were steady. His mandibles were still. His antennae, which had tracked every shift of argument across 7 hours, were perfectly level. The arbiter will recess for deliberation, Sethunkal said. Under Statute 11, Section 4, Subsection 9, Callum said, a recess during an active objection hearing requires the consent of the objector. The words landed in the chamber and spread outward in widening rings of comprehension. Delegates who had been reaching for their effects stopped. Aides who had been preparing to stand sat back down. The Velori Press Corps, which had begun powering down their arrays for the recess, reactivated them with a collective hum. I do not consent to a recess, Callum said. Sethunkal stared at him. The arbiter's compound eyes held the fixed quality of a being encountering a variable that did not fit any model he had constructed. 9 centuries of assembly procedure, 31 years of presiding, and a 26-year-old human was using the body's own rules to prevent the body's highest officer from leaving the room. The objector is within his rights, Sethunkal said. The words came slowly. The 8th hour began. Callum had been standing for longer than some of the assembly's formal sessions lasted in their entirety. His body had passed through the initial discomfort, through the sustained ache, and into a state that was almost mechanical, the way exhaustion sometimes strips away everything except the next action. His hands on the display cradle were the hands of someone holding a railing on a ship in heavy weather, not gripping for emphasis, but gripping because letting go meant falling. He had stopped shifting his weight because both legs hurt equally, and there was no preference to be had. His vision had narrowed to the space between the cradle and the arbiter's bench, and within that space, everything was perfectly clear. He continued. He spoke about the procedural history of Article 19. He cited the 7 previous instances in which Article 19 had been invoked, 3 of which had resulted in expulsion, and 4 of which had been dismissed for insufficient standing. He compared the standing evidence in each case to the Kishore petition. In every successful invocation, the petitioner had demonstrated concrete, measurable, completed economic injury. In every dismissed case, the petitioner had relied on projections and doctrines that the Star League had not ratified. The Kishore petition matched the pattern of the dismissed cases point for point. He spoke about the timeline. The Kishore petition had been filed at dawn and acted upon by mid-morning. Article 19 specified a 72-hour review period before any action could be taken on a petition. The review period had not been observed. The Terran delegation had been expelled before the review period began. Velandor interrupted. The 72-hour review period applies to standard petitions. Emergency exclusion petitions are exempt under the Expedited Action Clause. The Expedited Action Clause, Callum said without hesitation, was repealed 8 years ago by Amendment 41 to the Assembly's Procedural Code. The amendment was introduced by the Velori Commerce Committee and passed with a 78% majority. It eliminated the expedited pathway for all exclusion actions. He did not need to cite the amendment number. He had memorized it at 4 in the morning. The Trade Compact of Kishore cited the Expedited Action Clause in its petition filing. The clause does not exist. The Velori Commerce Committee's senior delegate, a thin carapace elder in the second tier, closed his compound eyes. The gesture was involuntary, the Velori response to institutional embarrassment. His committee had repealed the clause. The petition had cited it, and no one in the Arbiter's office had checked. He spoke about the composition of the session. Under Assembly rules, a vote on permanent exclusion required the presence of at least 70% of credentialed delegations. At the time the expulsion had been executed, 4 delegations had not yet arrived at the Assembly for the current session. Their absence had not been noted. Their votes had been recorded as abstentions, which under the Assembly's voting rules counted toward quorum but not toward the majority threshold. The effect was to lower the threshold for expulsion by precisely the margin needed to pass it. The 9th hour, a Kishori aide appeared at the chamber's side entrance, spoke briefly to the nearest marshal and produced a document. The marshal examined it, walked to the Arbiter's bench and handed it up. Sethon Call read it in silence. Then he looked at Callum. The Trade Compact of Kishora has filed a motion to revoke the objector's observer credential on grounds of institutional disruption. The chamber stirred. Callum felt something cold move through his chest, not fear but the recognition of a trap that he had anticipated but hoped would not be sprung. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for everything he could imagine being used against him, because that was what the procedural manual had taught him, that every right existed alongside a mechanism for its revocation, and the only defense was to know the mechanism as well as the attacker. Credential revocation under Assembly bylaw requires a formal hearing before the Credentials Committee, Callum said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the chamber carried every word. The Credentials Committee has not been convened. It cannot be convened during an active session without the consent of the presiding arbiter and the objector. Additionally, revocation on grounds of institutional disruption requires a finding that the credentialed individual has violated a specific provision of the Assembly's Code of Conduct. I have not been cited for any violation. Filing a procedural objection is not disruption. It is the exercise of a statutory right. Sethon Call looked at the document in his hand, then at Callum, then at the Kishori aide waiting at the side entrance. He set the document face down on his bench. The motion is denied as improperly filed. The session continues. The Kishori aide withdrew. In the 4th tier, Velandor's face had gone very still. She had played her strongest procedural card and it had been returned to her. The chamber watched her register this and file it behind an expression that revealed nothing, except the effort of revealing nothing. Callum's voice had thinned to a reedy whisper. The chamber's acoustics, designed for full-voiced oratory, picked up the whisper and carried it to every seat with an eerie clarity that transformed vocal failure into something that sounded deliberate. The voice of a man who had been speaking so long that the words had worn channels into his throat. He had moved beyond the petition now, beyond the 8 violations and the procedural failures, into the territory that he had been approaching all along. The question of whether the Star League Assembly had been acting as a neutral deliberative body or as an instrument of Kishori trade policy for the past decade. He cited 14 resolutions passed in the last 10 years that had disproportionately favored Kishori commercial interests. He cited 9 appointments to the Assembly's Trade Arbitration Panel that had gone to Kishori-aligned candidates, each appointment made during sessions when opposing delegations were absent or understaffed. He cited the funding allocation for the Assembly's Intelligence Bureau, which had received 60% of its budget from voluntary Kishori contributions for the past 7 years. Voluntary contributions, Callum whispered, and the acoustics carried it like an accusation read into a record, with no conditions attached, except that the Intelligence Bureau has not investigated a single Kishori trade complaint in those 7 years. and it has investigated 11 Terran complaints. All 11 resulted in findings against the Terran Confederation. Velandor had stopped interrupting. She sat in the fourth tier with her arms folded and her eyes fixed on a point above Callum's head, the posture of someone who had moved from anger through frustration into a region that was neither. Her aides had left. The Kishori delegation had consolidated into a tight cluster of 5, down from an original 14. The remaining 9 had quietly filed out over the past 2 hours, their departures spaced carefully to avoid the appearance of a coordinated retreat. By the 10th hour, something peculiar had happened to the chamber. The delegates who remained, perhaps 250, had stopped treating the session as a session. They had stopped checking the time, stopped glancing at the exits, stopped whispering to their aides. They were watching Callum the way beings watch a natural process that they cannot influence and do not fully understand, the way you watch a river cut through stone or a tide come in. The man on the platform had outlasted every procedural attack, every objection, every attempt to revoke his right to be there, and the simple fact of his continued presence had become the argument. The evidence was important. The citations were important. The procedural violations were important. But the thing the chamber could not stop watching was the stubbornness, the sheer physical refusal to yield the floor, which was not strategy or calculation, but something more fundamental and less rational. The thing that happens when a person decides that stopping is not a possibility, and then lives inside that decision until the decision becomes indistinguishable from the person making it. Callum's body had entered a state he recognized from the survival endurance modules at the Foreign Service Academy, the modules he had barely passed, the ones where they made you stand at a lectern for 6 hours reading technical manuals aloud, while the instructors raised the room temperature and dimmed the lights. The instructors had called it stress inoculation. Callum had called it miserable. He had scored in the 43rd percentile. He had not expected the training to be relevant. His legs were shaking in sustained micro-tremors that he could feel in his quadriceps and his calves. His vision had developed a slight tunnel quality, the peripheral edges dimming. His hands gripped the display cradle not for emphasis, but for structural support. He had shifted his weight so many times that both hips ached, and the small of his back had locked into a rigid knot that pulsed with each heartbeat. He kept speaking. He spoke about the Kishori Trade Compact's membership in the Assembly's Steering Committee and the correlation between Steering Committee, agenda items, and Kishori trade priorities. He spoke about the 3 occasions on which the Terran delegation had requested a formal audit of the petition process and been denied, each denial issued by a different procedural officer, each citing a different regulation, none of the cited regulations consistent with one another. This body, Callum whispered, and the acoustics carried it to every seat, has been captured, not by force, not by conspiracy, by money and patience and the assumption that nobody would ever stand here long enough to say it out loud. Somewhere in the building, a junior functionary in the Assembly's Office of Records was reading the live session transcript and counting the number of procedural violations Callum had identified. The count stood at 23. 23 instances in which the Assembly's own rules had been bent, ignored, circumvented, or flatly violated in the handling of a single petition. The functionary, whose job was to maintain the integrity of the Assembly's procedural record, had never seen anything like it. She had been at her post for 11 years and had never encountered a session in which the accumulated procedural failures formed a pattern so clear and so directional that the word for it was not error, but campaign. In the 4th tier, the last of Velandor's aides had departed. Velandor sat alone. Her arms were crossed, her cranial ridges faded to a uniform dull blue, the Kishori complexion of exhaustion. She had not moved from her seat in over 3 hours. She had not spoken in 4. The woman who had spent 3 years constructing the petition sat in the ruins of it and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the rules could protect her from. The 11th hour. The dome above the chamber showed stars now. Through the glass, the 3 Terran courier vessels were visible as points of running light against the dark, holding the same position they had held since morning. They had been there for 36 hours. The assembly had ignored them for 36 hours. They could not be ignored now, because the man on the platform had not stopped speaking, and the ships in the sky had not stopped waiting, and the patience of both was the same patience. The patience of a species that prepared for everything, and then stood in one place and endured until the preparation became unnecessary, because the room had already answered its own question. The Chelani delegate, Asara Vel, rose from her seat in the second tier. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who has been sitting for a long time and is aware that the next words she speaks will be entered into a record that will outlast everyone in the room. I request the Arbiter's attention. Sethankal's antennae turned toward her. The delegate from the Chelani Protectorate is recognized. The Chelani Protectorate withdraws its preliminary support for the exclusion vote. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who had arrived at a position through evidence rather than persuasion, and was therefore not subject to second thoughts. We request that our position be entered into the session record. Additionally, the Chelani Protectorate requests a formal review of the Trade Arbitration Panel's composition and funding structure, per the concerns raised during this hearing. The request was a depth charge. It was not enough to withdraw support. She was asking the Assembly to investigate the mechanism that had produced the petition in the first place. The institutional capture that Callum had described was now a formal matter. Silence. Then, from the 5th tier, the Thessani lead delegate stood. Her ears were rotated fully forward, locked in the Thessani posture of formal resolve. The Thessani colonial authority concurs. We withdraw support. The water rights data presented in this hearing does not match the data cited in the petition, and we intend to pursue that discrepancy through the Environmental Bureau. 2 delegations. The chamber's remaining occupants shifted in their seats, the collective motion of beings recalculating. The Drenai delegate, Torin Kal, did not stand. He raised one heavy bronze hand, palm outward, the Drenai gesture of formal assent that carried, in Drenai culture, the weight of an oath. Drenai Corridor Alliance. Withdrawn. The navigational buoys in the corridor are safety equipment. They have always been safety equipment. We will not support the prosecution of safety equipment. 3 delegations in 90 seconds. The arithmetic of the 2/3 majority, which had been the petition's foundation, collapsed. Without the Chelani, the Thessani, and the Drenai, the vote could not pass even if every remaining delegation supported it. Sethankal raised one hand. The gesture was unnecessary. The chamber was already silent. The Arbiter has heard the objection, Sethankal said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a being who had made a decision and did not intend to explain the reasoning. The Arbiter finds the following. First, the petition from the Trade Compact of Kishora was accepted without the mandatory 72-hour review period, citing an expedited action clause that was repealed 8 years ago by Amendment 41. This is a procedural violation. The petition is returned to the petitioner for refiling. Second, the expulsion of the Terran delegation was executed before the review period began. This action is void. The Terran delegation's credentials are restored with immediate effect. Third, the exclusion vote is struck from the session calendar. It may not be rescheduled until the petition has undergone the mandatory review and the petitioner has demonstrated standing under Article 19, Section 2. The chamber absorbed the ruling. It was not dramatic, it was procedural. It was the Arbiter doing what the Arbiter was designed to do, apply the rules. The rules had been there all along. They had simply needed someone to stand in the center of the room and read them aloud for 11 hours until the body could no longer pretend they did not exist. Velandor stood. The Trade Compact of Kishora formally protests this ruling. The protest is noted, Sethankal said. It will be reviewed in the next session. The current session is adjourned. The presiding arbiter descended from the high bench. His movement was slower than it had been at the start of the session, the weight of 11 hours of unbroken attention visible in the careful placement of his armored legs on the stone steps. He reached the chamber floor and walked past Callum Marin without stopping. At the base of the steps, he paused. "The assembly has existed for 912 years, Sethan Kal said, not looking at Callum. No single speaker has held the floor for more than 4 hours. The record was set by a Velori senator during the Chelani autonomy debates 2 centuries ago." He paused. His antennae tilted forward a fraction. "The assembly will need to update its records." He walked out of the chamber. His aides followed. The marshals followed the aides. The chamber emptied in a slow cascade, delegates rising from their seats and filing toward the exits in the murmuring procession of beings processing something they had not expected to process. Callum Marin stood on the platform. His legs were shaking. He gripped the display cradle with both hands and felt the tremor in his forearms, the deep muscular fatigue of a body that had been held in one position for too long. His throat felt as though it had been lined with powdered stone. His vision had the slightly telescoped quality of sustained adrenaline withdrawal. He was still standing because he had not given himself permission to stop, and the habit of not stopping was now the only thing holding him upright. Asaravel approached the platform. She was small, barely reaching Callum's shoulder, her gray skin creased with age and her dark eyes steady. "The Chelani delegation will support the restoration of Terran credentials in the formal record," she said. She spoke quietly, as though the volume of the past 11 hours had used up the chamber's allocation of sound. "I have communicated this to the Drena and Thessani delegations. They concur." Callum nodded. His voice was gone. He could feel the shape of words in his throat, but nothing came out. "Your senior delegation will return," Asaravel said. It was not a question. He nodded again. "Good." She looked at him for a moment with the appraising directness of someone who had spent a career learning to distinguish theater from conviction. "You were not supposed to be here. You were not supposed to be able to do this." Callum found a whisper, "No." "And yet you did it." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had not done anything extraordinary. He had read the rules. He had found the ones they had not followed. He had stood in the center of the room and recited them until the room ran out of ways to pretend the rules did not apply. The heroism, if it could be called that, was endurance. It was the decision to keep speaking after the 4th hour, after the 5th, after the 6th, when his body was telling him to stop, and the chamber was telling him to stop, and the only thing pushing him forward was the stubborn, irrational conviction that if he stopped, nobody else would start. The chamber was empty now. The holographic displays had powered down. The dome above showed nothing but stars and the faint running lights of the 3 courier vessels, steady and unchanged. Through the antechamber doors, Callum could hear the distant murmur of delegates in the corridor, the click of Velori legs on stone, the hushed Kishori consonants of a delegation recalibrating its position. He released the display cradle. He did not step down from the platform. He stood where he was and looked up through the dome at the stars, at the 3 small ships that had waited without orders because nobody had told them to leave, and they had not assumed the conversation was over. The lights dimmed to standby. Somewhere in the building, a maintenance algorithm noted that the session had run 11 hours and 14 minutes, flagged the duration as anomalous, and filed a request for the chamber's environmental systems to be recalibrated. The request would be processed in the morning. The algorithm did not know what had happened in the chamber. It only knew that something had lasted longer than expected. In the corridor outside, the Velori press correspondents were filing their reports. The story would reach the diplomatic wire services within the hour and the public networks by morning. The headline would vary by species and outlet, but the core of it was the same. A procedural motion that had been expected to remove the Terran Confederation from the Star League had been stopped by a single human who had held the floor for 11 hours using rules that the Assembly had written and then forgotten. Nobody would call it a speech. It had not been a speech. It had been something older and simpler and harder than a speech. It had been a refusal, a decision to stand in one place and say the thing that was true until the room acknowledged it, or until the room ran out of ways to deny it, or until the speaker collapsed, whichever came first. The speaker had not collapsed. The room had acknowledged it. The session was adjourned. Callum Marin, 26 years old, 9 weeks credentialed, 4th-tier observer, walked out of the Star League Assembly on legs that barely held him and into a corridor where nobody was waiting, because nobody had expected him to be here, and nobody had expected what had happened, and the corridor was just a corridor, lit by the institutional blue of the Assembly's overnight lighting, empty and quiet, and utterly indifferent to the fact that inside the chamber behind him, the longest session in the Assembly's 912-year history had just ended, and the only person who had spoken was a young man who had been left behind by accident and had refused, with the peculiar, irrational, unshakable stubbornness of his species, to be silent.